Okay, there we go. Another weekly wrap up. Andres, thanks for joining me again.
Yeah, not a problem, Kyle. Happy to be here as usual.
Always a pleasure. Okay, at the risk of repeating ourselves, Crownpeak has made an acquisition. Same thing we mentioned last week, I think. What's going on? Who did they buy this time?
Yeah, so this time Crownpeak acquired Illumino. We don't actually have any details of the deal in terms of how much it costs, but basically Illumino is a digital accessibility services and consulting firm. So basically they're the subject matter experts on everything accessibility and usability. And it turns out Crownpeak, I've been working with them already for about 2 years. So This is just an acquisition to help Crownpeak improve its automated accessibility scanning technology. So basically what it is it helps ensure that your company is meeting things like the web content accessibility guidelines. And then it's also compliant with the different like accessibility regulations worldwide. So accessibility is pretty much growing pretty heavily now in terms of things like you think like Google, the core web vitals, like if you want to assess your website, one of the things that it checks for is accessibility. So I think this is just Crownpeak trying to make sure that any sort of digital experience you build with them meets all the guidelines that you need to.
Yeah, and again, so this is their second acquisition in like the last few weeks. Last week we discussed their acquisition of Attract. We discussed that on DXPReport.com as well. So I'm just interested in this one specifically. I don't think I've seen an accessibility consulting firm be acquired in this space before. So I wonder, again, they haven't released the actual numbers here, so I don't know how big of an acquisition this was. Was it more of an acqui-hire thing? I kind of have a feeling it's more like an acqui-hire, where it's like, I feel like Crownpeak's, reason for doing this, or the primary reason for doing this, wasn't necessarily because they desperately needed, to bolster their accessibility features so much as it was more about just, they've worked with these guys for 2 years. They may have really, really liked a whole bunch of team members, and they just wanted to bring them in. And their accessibility expertise is a plus and a bonus. That's what I feel. But we don't really have the data. We just know that they have acquired them. They were working together for 2 years, and as you say, the accessibility sort of quote unquote market is growing, right? So the Googles of the world are putting more emphasis on that. But again, that still doesn't strike me as like, hey, let's go and buy an accessibility consulting firm. That's more of a thing of like, hey, let's go and hire a consulting firm, which I've been doing for 2 years. So it does lead me to think it's more of an acqui-hire. But yeah, it's an interesting one. But Crownpeak definitely on like a bit of a shopping spree right now.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay. What's next? I suppose I see. I'm looking at notes here. You want to talk about more about like some of the benefits of this acquisition, or should we just move on to the next one?
Yeah, no, it's just quick mention that like I think what you mentioned is pretty important. Like they might not see it as an immediate thing, like, hey, let's go and buy a company because we need it. But like, yeah, it's just they acquired it because they could, and there are definitely benefits to like doing it in the long run. In terms you can get more revenue, obviously reduce that legal risk, because I'm not so sure if anyone's necessarily enforcing the accessibility thing as much. Like
that's why I kind of feel like it wasn't necessarily that drove it. But yeah, you are right. I mean, and it could, maybe they know that it's going to be enforced in certain ways. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think all those are just things there. It was probably just an opportunity at the time, and we're like, okay, let's just do this now, so we don't have to do it later on.
Yeah, it feels like that to me as well. Okay, I think the next one we wanted to cover is we come across an article that we included in our newsletter yesterday about, does headless commerce have a home in your B2B e-commerce brand, right? So they're basically discussing, there's an article on Digital Commerce 360, and they're basically discussing, does headless commerce, or does a headless commerce platform, does it work for a B2B company, right?
Yeah.
What was your initial take on this article?
My first thing was, well, of course it works, but then as I started going through it, I kind of see what the points they were trying to make about it in terms of obviously we're in the industry right now, so we know that headless commerce is like one of the big buzzwords, one of the things everyone's thinking about and mentioning a lot. And obviously they have a lot of companies been getting a lot of funding and things like that because a lot of investors see it as like the way forward. But it's not necessarily something that you can just jump into either. So I think this article tries to like kind of shed some light on that fact.
Yeah, it does. And again, like you, that the initial title of it, I was like, well, yeah. But then, as you read, so I'll just, they've got 3 points here, right? So that the initial, so they basically said the summary of the article is, yes, headless commerce does fit into a B2B sort of environment, but there are caveats and there are things you need to consider, which is fair. So the first one is like investment time and employees. So the first point they make is, making this move to a headless framework, as they put it, headless ecosystem, headless environment, API first environment, again, moving away more than likely from some sort of monolithic or legacy suite. It's going to cost you time, investment. You have to retrain your staff, that whole migration process. That is an investment in more ways than one. So that's fair. But I don't necessarily, so one thing I've got here is like, I don't necessarily think any of their arguments are a good argument not to do it. It's just a good consideration to have. So the investment of time, employee retraining, that kind of thing is fair. Number 2 they've mentioned is market needs and expectations. So here they're basically saying, don't do it just because the market or because the buzzword is there. You have to sort of evaluate whether you're actually going to get a return on this investment, right? Again, good point, and I kind of feel like that could be said about anything, but most of the time, or a lot of the time, should I say, if you're an e-commerce company moving from some sort of monolithic suite, you could even in the long run end up, spending less money on your sort of a headless system, right? Especially if you're going from like an on-premise legacy monolith to a cloud SaaS, right? You got less developers having to work on that to maintain it. You're now sort of outsourcing some of that to the vendor. So if anything, they're talking about ROI here basically, and don't just pander to the market. Think about your ROI, and I think it's been spoken about to death. That a headless framework, headless ecosystem, API first ecosystem, and Mac architecture essentially, it can be more lightweight and it can be more cost effective in many different ways. So I kind of think it's a moot point, that second one. The third one is business commitment. So the investment in headless commerce isn't just monetary, it hits the business as well. Many business teams struggle to gain tangible value quickly from headless build-outs. After all, it does take time to build and leverage this framework. Again, yes, but really what this is saying is, if you don't have a plan, it's just going to be like, okay, we did it. Where's the benefit? Which again, you can say about anything. And if you don't have a strategy or a plan when you're moving to headless ecosystem, then of course it won't, immediately work or maybe even work at all. So, they're good considerations. I think it's a good article to read. But I don't feel like any of the points they made is a good reason not to move from legacy monolith to, headless commerce in some way, shape or form. I feel like simply the opportunity cost of not moving is that by itself is enough to sort of trump all of these. What do you think?
Yeah, I really want to hone in on the second point regarding like the market needs and expectations. Mm-hmm. I think the considerations like your time investment, employees, and obviously the business commitments. I think that's just an overarching. Those points are pretty similar. It's basically what's your business strategy, how much time and resources you're going to need to think. It's basically going to vary, but on a company by company basis. Like if you have legacy architecture that's slowing you down, that's requiring you to get so many developers, you have security breaches, all those sort of issues. Definitely, you should definitely be looking into it. But if you don't have that and you've been chugging along fairly well, there's benefits to it, but is it worth, are you going to get an ROI on that, on your initial investment? I think that's where the second point about the market needs and expectations, because what headless commerce does fundamentally, yes, you get speed improvements on your website and things like that. Like we've mentioned things with like the front end as a service and storefront builders of what they can do if you're just plain old e-commerce website. But if you're in a B2B industry where people just need to go to a website, they don't really, are they checking their, everyone's checking their phones, but are they really doing everything on their phones? Do they need to be maybe smart speakers, whatever it is, in terms of all these different devices? Is that really what your specific customer market needs. Do you need to like personalize things to such an extent? Yeah. So I think the market needs and expectations. I think that's worth real consideration if headless commerce is going to be right for you and your business. But the other stuff is really just, are you looking at it from a ROI perspective? And I think that can matter with any sort of new software, new technology, whatever you're going to invest in. I think those things you kind of have to do regardless, but the market needs and expectations specifically can matter.
Yeah. It's a good point. That's a good point. And, you know, even DXP Report, right? We are a very much B2B publication, right? And I was almost shocked at how little people read DXP Report, the newsletter, as well as the website on their phones. Like almost nobody, right? And it's like, wow, if this was like a consumer, you know, a B2C thing, it'll be the other way around. It'll be almost everybody's reading this newsletter or this blog content on their phone, and almost no one's reading on a laptop. So that, you know, that is very much, you know, something to consider. If you're going headless, probably the main driver is not that, okay, we need omnichannel now. We need to, you know, we need to sell our tractors via Alexa skills. Probably not, right? No one's buying tractors for Alexa skills. But again, back to your notes, you're making a good point here, which is going direct to consumer, right? So when you've got a more flexible tech stack, one, it could be more lightweight, can be more cheap, can be easier to maintain / no need for you to maintain it because the vendor's maintaining it, but also allows you to think of things like going D2C, as you mentioned in your notes here, because it gives you that flexibility, right?
Yeah. And because that was basically one of the things when they mentioned the article. It's like D2C should be considered. But like I think that even goes back to some of the things that we saw during the initial stages of the pandemic, where companies started to think about, okay, we can't sell how we used to before. We can't do this how we used to before. Let's think about going D2C. Let's think about all this. So I'm sure some companies might have just done that as an initial thing during like the pandemic initial stages. Then the others were like, okay, cool, we're really getting benefits out of this and thing. And I think that's another interesting thing there, in that a lot of companies, like 2 years ago, last 2 years, whatever you want to do it, they got a trial run for how ready or not ready they are, their market is for things like this. So I think companies weighing up whether they want to go headless or not, B2B vendors and things like that, they should be using the data that they got over the last years to determine, okay, is our market really going to benefit from this, or were they just kind of biding their time, you know?
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, let's move on to our third and final story here that we covered in yesterday's DXP Report newsletter. It is I hope I'm saying this right, Nuion. I don't know. They're an Amsterdam-based venture capital firm, and they've just raised a fourth round, 130 million euros, to invest in more B2B software startups. So they've previously invested in Prepper, which is obviously a headless CMS that we know of and will be relevant to people listening to this, but they've also invested in other SaaS companies. And it looks like they want to continue down that same route. So when I saw this, I was like, okay, interesting. I imagine they're not going to want to invest in another headless CMS, but they could look into, you know, since they're in that space, they're aware of the growth there. You know, headless commerce could be an interesting one for them. If I'm a headless commerce vendor right now, I'm sending these guys a Twitter DM, right? Yeah. So it's interesting. I just wanted to highlight that they're doing that, and they're already they've dipped their toe ahead of the space. So anybody in the Mac realm, which is growing and growing, should probably send a DM here.
Yeah, because I think it's like 20 new early stage B2B software startups. So that's kind of who they want to target. So I think anyone in that kind of category definitely fits.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, I think that's everything we wanted to cover. Short and sweet as usual. Anything else you want to cover, Andres?
Not today. Probably we'll have more for the next edition.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks again for joining me.
No problem.
Okay.